me start with a disclaimer. Not everyone's going to agree with what I'm about to share with you, and that's absolutely okay. I'm here to tell you the truth about the top 5 tests I rely most on in my autism practice. These aren't trendy tests from social media. These are the ones that help me build real, personalized care plans, especially when parents are stuck. Whether you're early in your journey or you've tried everything, these tests will give you targeted data and not just more noise. The first test, and I'll group them all together and just label it routine lab tests. But I'm going to take it a step further and say routine labs with a twist, because I tend to do a little bit more than the routine. When kids come into my practice, especially if they're supplementing with things or on certain medication, they have certain conditions that they've been dealing with, during my intake I will ask, when's the last time they had lab work? Sometimes it's at the yearly visit when they had it. If they're younger, sometimes it's they've never had lab work done at all, which is totally fine. I work a lot with pediatric population, so kids to young adults. When I say routine lab work, I'm thinking about things like blood sugar levels, thyroid panels, thyroid hormones, adrenal response, cortisol. Neurotransmitter actually falls under my routine testing. Micronutrients, so vitamins, minerals, certain inflammatory markers, certain digestive markers. These are things that I look for in my routine lab work. In the beginning, when I started practicing, I didn't rely so heavily on lab work, but I quickly transitioned into doing that because I found clinically that I generally get the best success when I'm looking at not only the clinical picture, but also comparing that to what's happening internally with the body. Best case scenario for me is that if the child is having symptoms, outwardly I can have some ideas based on what information is shared with me, but I want to compare that to what is showing up on the tests themselves. With routine lab work, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know what potentially might be influencing certain markers versus not. That's where the clinical judgment and clinical expertise comes in, and not just looking at a lab value per se. You have to understand what the lab marker is, but you also have to understand what potentially else could be influencing it. Just because it looks normal or abnormal doesn't necessarily mean that you have to treat or not treat it depending on what's happening. So one of the things that I find that a lot of doctors, especially in pediatrics, are overlooking is they are not really testing some of the most basic things. Outside of maybe iron levels, if the child has a tendency for iron deficiency anemia, or maybe some type of thalassemias, or issues that are expressing shortness of breath, blue nose, lips, fingers, things like that, some outwardly expressions that might give an indication that iron metabolism is not ideal. Generally, with pediatricians, are not really doing a whole lot of testing. I ran into an issue where I was treating a two-year-old child who was referred to my office from the pediatrician's office, and she had a TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, level of over 4.0. If you're familiar with thyroid stimulating hormone, that is the hormone that regulates the metabolism of every single cell inside of your body. So it is produced inside that little butterfly-shaped gland that we have that sits on the front of our trachea. When this level goes up, or this hormone level goes up, that gives an indication that the thyroid is underactive. It's not acting to its full potential. That means a lot of metabolic activity starts to slow down in the body. That can seem counterintuitive, especially for a young child, because we like to think kids are young, they're pretty resilient. That's true. Their energy metabolism might look very different from, say, a young adult or an older person. Sometimes those telltale signs of an underactive thyroid can be misrepresented or overlooked in small children. That's when we have to look outside of the box. So I thought that was surprising when I asked her mom, like, hey, she's got hypothyroidism, like she's literally 2 years old. What did your pediatrician say about this? They weren't even aware. They weren't even told that she was hypothyroid. That's a problem. That's a challenge. That should not happen. If there is a glaring problem, it should be addressed. And that's why it's really important to know what you're dealing with and what you're working with, and to do a proper clinical assessment so that you can put all of these labs into context relative to what's happening or what's manifesting with the child. Going back to the routine blood work, also included in there, CBCs. Sometimes I will test, depending on where the child is, some certain hormones outside of their cortisol. Sometimes I will look at their testosterone, their estrogen, progesterone, things like that, especially if they're on the cusp of puberty or are in puberty or having challenges. I will look to address and assess what's happening from the hormonal perspective. So these are more of my routine blood works. CBCs, lipids I rarely run in my smaller kids. Once they start hitting puberty, and definitely if there are metabolic issues that are going on, I will go ahead and run lipids, but generally I don't run a lipid panel for my little guys. Basic metabolic panel or comprehensive, depending on what's happening. I always want to look at electrolytes. That's been a thing that I see off and more kids than not. Between their potassium, their sodium levels, definitely want to make sure that we're assessing those things. Now, when we talk about routine blood work, and my routine blood work with a twist, these are things that generally can be covered by insurance. I'm going to say that with a caveat. As a naturopathic physician here in the state of Connecticut, where I am licensed to diagnose and treat, and I do personally in my practice is largely insurance-based, so I have the ability to order labs for my patients. I send my patients out to some of the bigger labs here, Quest, LabCorp, sometimes the local hospital, depending on what needs to be tested. And so long as there are the proper diagnosis codes and the lab coverage, those things can be covered quite easily through insurance. The second test that I run for years, I was running it almost exclusively, is something called a food sensitivity test. I know I might get a lot of backlash about this as well, because there are some people who just frankly don't believe in it, and that's their prerogative, but there is science behind it, and it does, clinically, I've seen it make a huge difference in a lot of my stubborn cases, especially when it comes to chronic illness in general, and largely inflammatory conditions as well. When I say food sensitivity test, you might be aware of some. They have ones that they were selling on Amazon and places there. These tests are not all created equally, and unfortunately for some, I've had to tell my patients, like, I'm sorry that you spent your money on this, but you just wasted your money. Sometimes the technology behind it is not great. Sometimes the company is a bit sketchy. That's happened with a few companies out there as of late. And you want to know that you're handing your samples over to companies that are going to handle your specimens with respect and also treat your data with respect. The over-the-counter tests, I generally don't recommend them, food sensitivity specifically. Now, one of the tests that I do use it quite a lot in my practice is a test where we're looking at not only IgGs. One thing a lot of people get confused about when we talk about food sensitivities, they lump food sensitivities, food allergies, food intolerances all into one thing. It's like saying it's all the same thing. Technically, it's not. Food sensitivity is very different than food allergies, which are mediated by something called IgG, versus food sensitivities are mediated by IgG. These are usually hypersensitivity delayed reactions, meaning once you consume something, you're not necessarily having an immediate reaction. You could have a reaction 30 minutes later. You could have a reaction up to 3 or 4 days later. It's just a hyper-exaggerated delayed response. With the test that I use, we're testing the presence of the antibody. If you're consuming a food or food product and your body's mounting an immune response, it's going to create the antibody. That's how part of our immune system functions. There's something that is triggering the immune system. It's not liking it. It wants to neutralize it and get rid of it. So IgG, one part. The second part of this test is something called complement. So complement, explain it simply, is really like an overarching branch of our immune system function. This is the first trigger that thing sets all the cascades to take action. So that gives us kind of two ways to kind of look at this, the sensitivity reaction of the food testing. Now, I prefer the test that I use because it's not just looking at foods. Sometimes people say, my child is allergic or sensitive to this food. They just can't tolerate it. If I take the skin or the peel off, they're fine. If not, they're having issues. Sometimes it's not necessarily the food or food product itself. Sometimes it could be what's in it or what's on it. Think things like pesticides, or now we're heading into summer season, a lot of pollen's outside. Those things could actually be the true triggers and not necessarily the food itself. What I like about the test that I use is it's looking at foods, but it's also looking at things like food additives, so MSG, polysorbates, stabilizers, certain types of spices, oils, seeds, a whole gamut of things that could be impacting the quality of the food that one is consuming. The other part of this particular test that I use is, depending on which tier that you choose, they will do something called a gut barrier panel. So that will give us a snapshot into the gut to see what's happening. Is there any candida or yeast overgrowth? And the candida is not the only yeast that our body contains. Is there any type of microbial dysbiosis? That would be looked at by something called LPS, or lipopolysaccharides. Is there any true leaky gut? There are markers that we can look at to assess the stability of the integrity of our tight junctions, our gap junctions, that are ideally supposed to hold things in our GI system. Once they're compromised, they start to open up and things can leak out of our GI system and travel pretty much anywhere into the body and wreak havoc. So these are things that can be looked at just looking at a food sensitivity panel. We can look at the foods and food products, but we can also get a snapshot of what's going on with the gut. That brings me to my next thing. Stool testing. And this is comprehensive stool testing. This is a real microbiome clarity. With a true comprehensive stool analysis, what we're looking at, we don't have to guess anymore. We don't have to say, okay, yeah, we know there's some things happening, but we now know precisely bacteria, fungi, viruses. It's looking at all of those things. It's looking at the bacteria in general, the good bacteria versus commensal bacteria. It's looking at different types of viruses. It's looking at different types of yeast in our system. And I mentioned previously, candida is not the only yeast that our bodies contain. We have so many different types of yeast. Candida is just a nuisance because it's everywhere. It's found in our bodies. It's found out in the environment. It's what we term as ubiquitous. It's everywhere. We can't really get away from it. We need to learn how to make our bodies inhospitable for them taking over. It will also give us some, how well is the digestive capacity? Is there any issue with fat in the stools? Is there any blood in the stool? Are there any inflammatory markers in the stool? Are there any parasites or worms? Comprehensive metabolic microbiome testing is huge. It may be on the pricey side, but we get a lot of information for what we are looking for. I know there's a lot out there about everybody needs parasite cleanse out. Parasites are coming out through the skin when you take a bath. Don't believe all this hype. Yes, we are exposed to a lot of different things, and sometimes we are exposed to parasites, but sometimes our immune systems are able to handle it. You might have been exposed to a parasite, you don't even know it because your body cleared it out and didn't make it a hospitable place for it to stay and thrive. So very important to know, just because something is new and hot and socially on trend does not necessarily mean your child is experiencing that and needs to go that route. So with stool testing, it's hugely beneficial because we get a snapshot of what's going on. As one of my professors, Dr. Z, used to say, when you are in doubt, treat the gut. The gut, most of our immune system starts there, so it's a pretty good starting point if we think about therapeutics. The next test, the fourth one, is what I'm going to group as environmental. These are heavy metals, mycotoxin, environmental pollutants, glyphosate testing. All these types of tests, less commonly discussed, less commonly ordered. As we are exposed to more and more things, these things are becoming very important for how our body is able to actually detox and handle the things that we are inundated with on a day-to-day basis. So if we think about it, mold, heavy metals, environmental toxins, these can all stall the progress of our children. One of the things specifically about heavy metals is they bind up valuable nutrients that our bodies need to actually function and function correctly. So we have to make sure that we're looking at this to rule in or rule out certain things that may or may not be happening. Unfortunately, for the environmental things, the majority of them are often out of pocket, but there is a high return on investment for those chronic mystery cases where we're just trying to pull all the pieces of the puzzle together to create this clinical picture and a treatment action plan. The fifth test I do is really important and also highly underutilized is genetic testing. I will group it with oxidative stress markers because some of them are just genetic markers anyways. So when we talk about genetic testings, I want you to think about three things. We have our single nucleotide peptides, which are called SNPs. We have our chromosomal microarray, and then we have our whole exome sequence. If we're thinking about kind of least to most. So single nucleotide peptides, basically when there's one small change to these molecules, that can change the function and action of the molecule itself, which can create havoc. Now the next one, chromosomal microarrays, these are looking at duplications or deletions in the genes. This is pretty, say black or white. It's either there or it's not. Then finally, we get to the top tier, which is the whole exome sequence. Generally, these are ordered by geneticists, but where we have the ability to order them here in the state of Connecticut as naturopathic physicians, we're looking at the entire genome. There are many different tests out there to use, but basically looking at the entire genome, trying to figure out what comes up. And sometimes you don't get anything, but sometimes something new pops up. Basically, these random mutations, they're not there in the literature. They haven't seen it before. It's brand new. Sometimes it happens and there's nothing that comes of it clinically, but then sometimes it does seem to make a difference clinically. We just have to be mindful of that. One thing I really want you guys to know is with the genetics is these are the cards that we're dealt with. We may have genetic predispositions, but we cannot change our genes. However, we can change how our bodies respond based on what we feed it or what we don't give it. So our genes are not necessarily our destiny, but they do inform the strategy with which we move forward with treatment if we need to. And I say if because I know a lot of practitioners out there, if you have this genetic mutation or predisposition, you just need to do X, Y, and Z. No, don't do that. You treat based on symptoms. If you're not having symptoms, don't treat. Okay? A bonus one I want to give is testing-wise is tick-borne illness. Here in the Northeast, huge. Lyme disease, Babesia, Bartonella, a lot of these tick-borne illnesses can be hidden by the immune system, and they may mock or look like other things. Lyme is what's known as the great imitators. People can manifest many different symptoms and not necessarily be those issues, but actually Lyme. Just because your child may have been exposed to a tick, but they didn't have a bullseye, does not necessarily mean that they don't have Lyme. Also, don't assume that ticks are the only insect that carries Lyme, because we know that that's not true nowadays either. So that's just a bonus. As I'm wrapping up for today, I know that was a lot of information, but here's the bottom line. You don't need to run every single test out there. You just need to run the ones at the time for what your child is dealing with. I've seen these 5 tests give families more insight there and help to minimize the confusion that they've been experiencing. If this has helped you reframe how you're thinking about testing, hit the like button so I know to create more content like this. Drop a comment if you've ever felt lost in the testing rabbit hole, or if one of these tests that I mentioned made sense for you. If you want to know where to start with your child, I do offer food and behavior breakthrough sessions, and the link is in the description. This is something that we can talk about on that call so that you don't have to keep on guessing. You can move forward with a strategy and know what steps to take from there. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.